Hello. Very good. Thank you. This is Dr. James Hansen, who is the first scientist to sound the alarm in front of the U.S. Congress in 1988. He was also director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies for 32 years. You'll forgive me, until he resigned, famously saying that he couldn't both work for the U.S. government and sue them at the same time.
Thanks. So, do we have a crisis, an emergency? For sure, scientists have been pointing out the growing urgency of climate situation for more than a decade without much effect. But at last, thanks to some brave young people, the matter is getting more attention. We owe these courageous young people more than gratitude. We must make sure that the spark Greta struck is the turning point. You know, I expect these young voices will continue to grow louder, but that is not enough, I'm sorry to say. So if I may speak to the young people, I must say we need even more from you. We need your idealism, your open minds. We need your honesty. I'm asking a lot, but it's for your own sake, for your children and grandchildren and other life on the planet. You must understand and advocate policies that are needed. And it is a difficult problem. It's not just a climate problem. It's an energy problem and a human rights problem. To solve a difficult problem, you need the scientific method. The scientific method appears to be simple, but in practice it is difficult, especially the last point. Your preference, your ideology must not affect your assessment.
And I'll point out, as I always do, that we have an ideology, almost globally accepted, that growth, economic growth, will save us. And this is, to me, contrary to the truth.
Old people have trouble with this last requirement. Let's start with energy. The Industrial Revolution transformed people's lives. 1 gallon of gasoline contains the work equivalent of 400 hours labor by a healthy adult. Fossil fuels lifted half of the world out of poverty. Now the other half wants to follow that path, and they have the right to pursue that path. Nations that developed rapidly after World War II were wealthy by 1975, and their emissions stabilized, partly because of oil price increase in the 1970s by a factor of 10. The graph on the right is the same as the data on the left, but with a linear scale and a shorter period. Growth of energy use in the developing world is not over. It's just beginning in places such as India, whose population will pass China's within a few years. That does not mean that the problem is impossible to solve, but the solution requires understanding of the situation and understanding of what is needed. Climate change is proportional to cumulative emissions. This is the per capita cumulative emissions. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany have contributed most to climate change. We have no moral basis to ask developing countries to constrain their growth. Countries such as India need massive amounts of energy to raise living standards. This is an important chart. Fossil fuel use is still growing. Clean, carbon-free energies are nuclear, hydroelectric, and most renewables. Our governments give huge subsidies to renewable energies, the green area, but that has not stopped the growth of fossil fuels, let alone caused their phase-out. Energy is needed to raise living standards. Improved living standards are needed because population tends to peak when countries become wealthy. Fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, provide most of that energy. The developing world has enormous energy needs, and they get most of their electricity by burning coal. China emits more CO2 than the U.S., and India's population will soon pass China's, and their emissions will pass the United States. Developing countries want to raise their standard of living, and they have the right to do that. Now, I have been arrested several times for protesting coal mining.
11 at last count?
No, not quite that many, because I learned that the coal was being shipped to China. China has the right to raise their living standards just as we did. So we must work with China to reduce their emissions. How much do we need to reduce emissions? In 2007, Bill McKibben told me that he was going to form an organization, 450.org. And I said, no, 450 is a disaster if you leave it in the air for long, because we would eventually lose all coastal cities. The safe level is something less than 350 ppm, but we are already at 410 ppm. We are already into the dangerous level of atmospheric CO2. So we have a big challenge, but we still have a spectacular planet, which is worth preserving. And we cannot make another one like this on Mars. We must save this one. It is not an unsolvable problem. You may hear someone say, because of Earth's energy imbalance and amplifying feedbacks, our goose is cooked, that we are in for a runaway climate change. You should ignore such people and think about the matter rationally. Let me show a couple of graphs to aid your understanding. This graph is the fraction of the eventual surface temperature change in response to a forcing that is applied to the climate system and maintained. For example, an increase of CO2 that remains in place. Half of the surface temperature warming occurs quickly, but much of the surface warming requires centuries to occur. Note that the timescale is logarithmic after year 100. So we can avoid a large fraction of the warming by removing the forcing before the warming is complete, or by counteracting it with a negative forcing. So in summary, the urgency of the climate crisis is not obvious to most people, because climate impacts so far are limited by the inertia of the ocean and the ice sheets. But more warming already is in the pipeline, and it will drive amplifying feedbacks, such as melting of permafrost and ice sheets, unless we remove the forcing. So there is a danger that young people inherit a situation out of their control, which is potentially a great injustice to young people, and an injustice of the industrial north, which has burned most fossil fuels, to low-latitude people who suffer the greatest effects, and injustice of humans to all other species. All of these are an injustice to young people, as young people inherit a planet that could become ungovernable. Because if emissions stay high, the subtropics and tropics will become undesirable places to live. Pressures to migrate will rise, and we can build walls, but it would not be a great planet, potentially ungovernable. So you need to understand the mistakes that we old people made. Mistake number one, we subsidized fossil fuels. The solution is to have a carbon fee that makes the price of fossil fuels honest. The people will not accept a carbon tax if the money goes to the government. But the money should be distributed uniformly to all the public, and then 70% of the people come out ahead. That's what we call carbon fee and dividend. You need to cover all of the fossil fuels. the merits are that this is transparent, the public can understand it and support it, and it stimulates innovation.
Can you go back for a moment? The no leakage is an important point because the United States and other countries can say that they've reduced their fossil fuel emissions by exporting, by sending all of the manufacture to China. That's leakage.
Yeah, and most rich people have a large carbon footprint, so they're going to lose money. They'll pay more in increased prices than they get in the dividend, but they can afford it. And this will be somewhat of a correction for the wide disparity in wealth that has developed. Mistake number 2, killing the cleanest energy, fission power. That happened in part because in the 1970s, the follow-on to the Vietnam War, the activism against the Vietnam War, the natural follow-on was activism against nuclear power. And this film about the 3 Mile Island, this film occurred at the same time as the 3 Mile Island power accident, and enthusiasm for nuclear power dissipated, even though it was determined later that the radiation from the accident did not harm Pennsylvania residents. Nuclear waste has not harmed anybody. We even know what to do with it to store it in geological storage, but the baby boomers stopped that from happening. And you compare that with the waste from fossil fuels, which is deposited in the atmosphere and travels all around the world. China did an inadvertent experiment by providing free coal for winter heating to people in North China for several decades. It reduced the life expectancy 5.5 years. Globally, outdoor air pollution, mainly from fossil fuel burning, is killing more than 3.5 million people per year. That's 10,000 people per day. Aerosols that people breathe are so tiny that they enter the bloodstream, causing cardiac problems as well as respiratory problems. Indoor air pollution from burning of coal, wood, and other biofuels kills an additional 3.7 million people per year. Many of the deaths from air pollution, like those from smoking, are prolonged and painful to the victim and the family. It's said that, well, nuclear power is too slow. In fact, if you look at the history, the fastest installation of electricity has been when governments decided to install nuclear power plants. Even now, if I update this to 2019, 5 out of the 6 fastest examples are nuclear power. Of course, we want all clean energy sources. This is a graph of carbon intensity. You see the 2 countries that rapidly reduced their carbon intensity were Sweden and France, and they did that by installing nuclear power. This is my oldest grandson at the age of 7, reading an Indiana Jones book about an urgent problem. When Connor was 10 years old, he identified the 2 key characteristics. He says, unless older people are leaving kids a situation where unless they can figure out how to make a time machine that actually works, there's going to be no way for them to go back and fix it. And grown-ups are afraid of nuclear power, but they should be scared of what will happen if they keep doing what they're doing, because we know that fossil fuels are not safe. They're very dangerous. And there are, the nuclear power that we have now, which caused an accident in Fukushima, is 50-year-old technology. We now know how to make reactors that will shut down automatically in case of an earthquake or a tsunami or something else, and do not require external power to keep them cool. This is just one of the technologies. There are numerous startup companies that, and the thing that I like, and by the way, my barn is covered with solar panels, and we generate much more electricity than we use, because I'm all in favor of renewable energies. But I'm also in favor of modern nuclear power. This is actually an old nuclear power plant, but you can see that the good thing about it is it has such a small footprint to generate enormous amount of energy. And that's what China and India want.
That's an important point, modern nuclear power, because a lot of the fear was generated by old generations of nuclear power, which are inherently flawed.
Yeah, after learning about China's appetite for coal, I was invited by the Kissinger Institute to attend a meeting with high-level people in China. What I learned was that they really would like to have modern nuclear power, not 50-year-old technology. But, you know, we have prohibited, the United States has prohibited companies from transferring technology to India or China.
Which administration did that occur under? Do you remember?
It has
various.
It is various, right? We need to understand that we're in the same boat. We're all going to suffer or enjoy the same consequences. We have to work together. We burned the fair share of the carbon budget of the rest of the world. Now the budget is essentially used up. Now we've got to figure out how to continue to let these other countries raise their standards of living, but without destroying the future of young people.
I want to emphasize that point because the negotiators are still talking about an imaginary carbon budget. The IPCC has confirmed we have this much carbon budget. We have no more carbon budget.
Yes, that's a good point, because they'll say, they frighten young people by saying, oh, we have 10 years and 9 months left of carbon budget, and young people get worried. This is another thing that we're doing to young people. My daughter-in-law is a child psychologist and psychiatrist. She has a booming business. Young people, we are frightening young people. And when I was young in a class of 100, nobody had panic attacks, or the kind of problems that many young people have now. We have an obligation to treat our young people better and take responsibility. The other mistake, what happened, you know, let me skip to this chart. You know, I was born before the United States entered World War II. And my favorite president, at least one of my favorites, was Harry Truman. You know, the things that were done at the end of World War II, we're now saying, oh, maybe we don't like that kind of world. Well, in fact, it was very positive actions. Truman was behind the Marshall Plan for Europe. He campaigned for civil rights, despite the fact that he knew he would lose all of the South. He fired General MacArthur, who wanted to take a war into China. And the United States provided leadership in forming the United Nations and NATO and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and global economic cooperation. And this lifted all boats. It's not us versus them. Cooperation can lift all countries. And we shouldn't give up on that. But we need to fix the problems that we older people allowed to happen with the kind of trade agreements which favored big business, big pharmacy, big banks, and the tax laws favor the wealthy. And worker rights favor industry, the lack of worker rights. These are things which we allowed to happen, but we live in democracies, at least most of us do. We need to use the system rather than balming the system. We need to fix it. And we're going to need young people to understand these problems because we older people have not done a very good job of fixing them. I think...
About 6 minutes left.
Yeah, let me just mention a couple of things. Washington has become a swamp where both parties are strongly influenced by special interests, by money. We need to have a campaign finance reform so that politicians are not allowed to take money.
A famous meme in America is that we have the best democracy in America that money can buy.
Yeah. There are, well, I'm hoping that the next election will move things in the right direction. On the long run, I think we need a third party, but we need ranked voting before you can do that so that you don't become a spoiler. One other thing we can do is use the judicial system. My oldest grandchild and I are plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the Trump government in the United States. They've managed to delay the trial, but I think we will eventually get our day in court.
Hopefully it'll be a delay until a Democratic victory next election, but...
Well, I have hopes that even the current court would see the constitutional rights for equal rights and equal protection of the law, due process are being denied young people. So I think that we have a good chance of winning in court. And there are other lawsuits that I hope we can pursue, including lawsuits against the fossil fuel industry for misleading the public and not becoming an energy industry instead of a...
We'll be discussing some of these lawsuit aspects on Thursday with Dr. Hansen and an attorney he works with.
Well, I think perhaps I should end it there, and I could get into some science, but we have only a few minutes, so...
Yeah, we have about 3 minutes left, so thank you.
Thanks.